So one I guess that just popped in that we can go ahead and address is in the chat right now regarding the use of fire by indigenous people and how that affects our perception of historic fire conditions. So I think this question is getting at jumped around, getting at the importance of humans in what we consider a natural fire regime in the East.
I mean, I can start with that, but I think somebody like Reed Noss is probably even better qualified to deal with it. Yeah, so it's really the question is what is natural? And it is true that over the Holocene, there have been people and varying degrees of burning. And so what our target is and what the natural historical fire regime is in many places in the East, it's an anthropogenic fire regime as much as it is a natural fire regime. That said, there are lots of fire adapted plants out there that whose adaptations must be owed to lightning ignitions that precede human occupants of the landscape. And as I mentioned, for the Blue Ridge and some areas in coastal plain, there are places that would have naturally burned pretty frequently, even without human burning. So there's a mix, really, spatially across the region in terms of how much these human set fires would have modified the fire regime. But I think Reed Noss is probably the best qualified person to answer that question.
Go ahead, Reed. What's natural?
I'll give it a shot. I consider an indigenous population that's, lived in an area for a long time, using traditional techniques to be as natural as a natural disturbance regime. But I was going to mention there's another more recent paper by, I think it's Abrams and Nowacki. I think it's 2013 or so. They looked at the Anthropocene burning hypothesis, and basically they looked throughout the eastern United States, and up until the mid-Holocene, natural ignitions and climatic factors dominated anthropogenic factors as controls on the fire regime. But beginning around in the mid-Holocene, and especially over the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, as I recall, that's when human burning really became the dominant factor for ignitions and control of the fire regime, with one exception. There was one exceptional region, which is outside of our scope today, but that's the area where I live, the southeastern coastal plain, where lightning remained the dominant ignition source up until very recently, up until like 200 or 300 years ago, depending on exactly where you are. But in general, I mean, human burning and Stambaugh's papers show that too, and the anthropogenic signature in most burning over the last 2,000 or 3,000 years. So that's long enough to start to influence evolution. Although it's important to remember some of these fire adaptations we see in these species go back hundreds of thousands to millions of years. So if we look at the evolutionary fire ecology of the system, we have to consider that lightning over time has shaped adaptations more than human activity. But over the last couple of thousand years, humans have started to have a real influence and could be starting to shape evolution as well. And so it's as natural as anything, I guess. That question of what is natural, that's been debated for so long, and we still don't have an answer.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Can I hop in? I'm way out of my territory, so but just for fun, at least, I think there's some pretty credible evidence that humans increased oak and hickory species because they were being used as a food plant. And I bring this up just because recently I had a wonderful cookie that was made out of acorn flour with maple syrup and hickory nuts in it, made by Russ Cohen. And I thought, wow, I'm all for bringing back oak and hickory as food plants. So.
And that's definitely true, Mark. And what a lot of the argument is over is how extensive that anthropogenic influence was. With some people arguing that it was just in the vicinity of major trails and village sites, and others arguing it was across the entire landscape. And that sort of gets tricky because the evidence is a little thin to really make that distinction sometimes.
Chris just posed another great question I want to turn to for everyone on the panel. So feel free to take a swing at it. So when considering carbon as a factor in conservation planning, do we care if carbon is concentrated in just a few trees versus fewer smaller trees or forest soils? Is it all just carbon, or do we want to tailor conservation depending on where the carbon goes, where it's allocated?
I think
I
I know
asked
what
for
Mark,
sticky wickets.
I think I know what Mark would say.
I want to know
What would Abby say?
Well, I think if we want more than one benefit, right? I mean, then we have an interest in how it's distributed. If it was just carbon for carbon's sake, I do think that's a really important issue. And Mark, you've alluded to it a couple times. I mentioned it briefly, but you know, I even worry about that a little bit with the carbon markets. But I think, right, if we want to think about maximizing not just carbon, but biodiversity, and then also think about things like water quality. And we really need to care about our understory and, you know, the larger forests that are going to be unique habitat for some of those species that are at risk. So it's an interesting question. There's probably some people that would just say it doesn't matter.
I'll also jump in and say, I think this is a question that needs to get re-asked at the upcoming lecture from Dr. Smart. It's reminding me of her work. Anyone else want to weigh in on this interesting question? Me, it's pinging around my brain pretty fast right now, and I'm having trouble settling on a thought.
Yeah, I don't have an answer. I'm going to share a few first thoughts. I mean, that's why I asked the question. From a carbon resilience perspective, and this is just a hypothesis, I'm just thinking that if it's below ground, it's probably the most resilient over time. That's a first thought. So from the climate action perspective, below ground's really good. I don't know if other carbon experts would agree. It's just a first thought. And then from the, like you said, Abby, basically from the multi-dimensional solution space that conservation tries to optimize on, I would think first of all, we would care, and that a lot of the ecosystem services and I think it's fair to say in general, they're going to be correlated with lots of carbon packed in a few large individuals, rather than even age stand with medium-sized or small trees, each one having a modest amount of carbon. But then again, disturbance resilience might be higher if you've got a diverse, or at least a distribution across many smaller trees. I don't know which way it goes. Just thoughts.
Go ahead and unmute yourself, Reed.
I thought I did, sorry. So I just want to second that. Everything I've been reading on this topic suggests that below ground carbon storage is more secure, and it's likely to be especially important in these times of really increasing disturbance, especially in places like in Western forests. And so there was a study done by Das and co-authors in California, I think published in 2018, that showed that grasslands and savannas are more secure carbon storage areas or systems than forests, because most of that carbon is stored. The vast majority of it is stored below ground. And especially in old growth grasslands or ancient grasslands and savannas, there are specialized adaptations, underground storage organs, what some call underground forests, where the vast majority of the carbon is stored. And these are often systems that have been around relatively depending on where you are, I mean, thousands of years. So we have old growth underground forests that are older than our old growth above ground forests in many cases. Now, in the Central Apps, I don't think it's quite as relevant. So I'm talking more about the big picture across the country and the world.
I was just having another thought about that. I had never thought of that, about where the carbon is most secure, but that makes sense. And even with a harvest, Chris, you're below ground. I mean, well, certainly you lose above ground carbon in a harvest, but I mean, in terms of the compaction of the soil and things, is that soil carbon is fairly well protected. And then the second piece it brought up for me is that would you all also say, the ecologists here, that where we have the most soil carbon, those are the healthiest forests, meaning in terms of their ability to be resilient to invasives, to just general degradation. Certainly the best for water quality, right? You're going to get really good filtration in those places. So I just was thinking, oh wow, those high carbon soils might be an interesting priority, not just for carbon, but also for other values.
I'm going to
And then I was thinking, could you identify them, like show the percentage of, like we could map, I'm sure you could easily, the percentage of soil carbon driving the carbon score,
Yeah, it already, Chris's data already shows you the percent above ground carbon versus below ground carbon. It's pretty interesting.
Right, but we've never seen it across the landscape. Yeah.
Well, it's in the total ecosystem carbon, so you can subtract and get. But I mean, I know what's under the hood there in the modeling, and we don't. I mean, it captures some of the climate and hydrology variation that would influence the rate of decomposition and the structural component of carbon, mineral soil carbon, that kind of thing. So it models some of those elements. It's based on Century, another model that was designed to capture these phenomena. But I wouldn't want to overstate its potential to characterize those below ground dynamics. I think it gives us a great first look, but the proportions are the proportions for allocation are relatively fixed. They are going to respond to climate, but there's not enough. I think there's not enough, and soil type, and all of that is incorporated, but there's not quite enough information in the modeling framework to do a really, gold standard job of answering that question.
I'll just want to jump in and say, and this is responding to some conversations I've had in the last few months, not with this group, about like there's a lot of which species is the best, really, like species A conserves more carbon or fixes more carbon faster. And I really am uncomfortable in those conversations thinking, the idea is not to find the best species and then have plantations of that species to maximize carbon. In my mind, diversity is still a critical piece. So we need a diverse species composition. We need mixed age structures. We need overstory, understory, subcanopy. We really have to think more about options, the many options and all the different roles that species play as we go forward, so that we're not just trying to maximize the carbon.
I think that's a very important point, and it's one reason I was happy to be here and talking about fire, because one concern I've had is that the fire adapted vegetation will be sacrificed to carbon goals. There's just sacrificing natural areas for something that's not really their fault. More carbon in the atmosphere than desired is, that would be very short-sighted. Those ecosystems deserve to be conserved for other reasons than just their carbon sequestration and storage capabilities.
And I think that those observations are being echoed in a chat comment just posted by the Western Conservancy. Reads, don't we want landscape portfolios that are diverse with carbon stored in vegetation and soil, different soil types, but also other places with old growth. And so kind of what I'm reading there is, diverse portfolios of natural area preserves protected for different reasons. There doesn't need to be a one size fits all preserve. You want diversity in not just the species, but in your rationale for protecting these places, that there is diverse, appropriate rationale for protecting forests and natural areas. But I do want to make sure we touch on two questions. One, I'm going to ask first, just questions we got from the audience that I want to make sure people get some time with. One, I'll stay with the soil right now because we're on fire for a while and we're having a lot of fun thinking about soil right and below ground. And this question asks us, anyone looking at forest management practices and impacts to mycorrhizal species and communities and other below ground systems? So is anyone familiar with more resources on those topics and considerations? While folks are thinking, I'll start with return and with another plug for the SMARD lecture that's coming up in early December. If the person who posed that question, I would strongly encourage you to register and participate in that. Her work definitely gets at that. And then since Mark's dealing with a howling dog, it sounds like in the chat, I will also reference a book that Mark turned me on to by Merlin Sheldrake, and he actually mentioned it in his presentation as well, but about below ground biodiversity and ecosystem functions as driven by mycorrhizal associations and just fungus independently. But it's a great book about below ground biodiversity, and that author is a mycologist who studies in tropical systems, but this book is written about fungal and below ground biodiversity worldwide. So since Mark wasn't here to make that reminder, I did it for him. But any other thoughts on this interesting question?
I'd be surprised if forest management had no effect on the health and vigor and extent of fungal networks. I think that it would. And also, I mean, it's not just fungal networks. Those are really cool and interesting and fun to learn about, but also just the diversity, the composition of the fungal community can be really different, and it can be tied pretty strongly to species. Like there are some tree and forest types that are co-adapted or coincident with brown rot fungi versus white rot fungi, and those decompose carbon and wood to different degrees. And some of the lignin is more recalcitrant, and it would be decomposed by the white rot fungi, but not the brown rot fungi. And so that kind of founder effect or umbrella effect of the tree species that influence the fungal networks can have a strong influence on the amount of carbon that turns over and its residence time. So that also is an interesting feature that's worth thinking about. And
does anyone have any comments then with regard to time and below ground biodiversity following a disturbance? I'm familiar with some work done with ag systems and grasslands that show changes in microbial biomass and diversity once tillage ends and perennial species are reestablished. Anyone on the panel want to familiar with that sort of pattern and those sorts of research questions within forested systems following disturbance, whether microbial diversity increases and microbial biomass increases with time after something like a commercial clear cut? That's okay. That's okay. We'll ask Dr. Simard. Okay, so we've talked about charcoal and soils and some forest management invasives. Another question in here that's still lit up in green in my shared sheet here is pulling us back away from producers and to consumers. So the question is, broadly, what about dealing with deer? And so we have a lot of fire managers here. As I've noted, anybody that's a land manager here deals with this issue, whether it's with respect to rare plant conservation, or other land management goals. I shared some thoughts about this in my presentation, and I'll also restate a recommended reference. Dr. Blosey, or Blase, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Blossey out of Cornell, has done a lot of great recent ongoing research with respect to deer ecology and forest health and productivity. So I'd refer the individual to ask that question to that work, but open it up to the panel to have share any experience or thoughts they have about deer management with respect to forest health and resilience.
I'll share just an anecdote. I've done a bunch of work at the Harvard Forest, which is close to where I live in Massachusetts, and Ed Faison, Faison, and David Foster had developed a set of plots in a clear cut, where that clear cut was designed to increase landscape level diversity and create habitat openings for bird species and other wildlife that likes to occupy a clear cut, or that kind of regenerating landscape. It really wasn't a full clear cut, it was more a reserve tree kind of treatment. And in that plot, they put a range of different exclosures. And some of those exclosures excluded everything, basically, and others excluded deer, and others excluded smaller organ like browsers. And I mean, it was really impressive and striking. This is probably familiar for lots of people who've walked forests, but really striking how much taller the trees were when you exclude the browsers, the grazers, particularly the browsers, including deer. I mean, it's just a massive difference. The pin cherry, which was one of the early successional species that was growing into that environment, where every single one where the deer could browse had like about 10 different shoots coming off the top because it kept getting eaten off, and it would resprout. And so it can have really significant effects, certainly on the rate of carbon accumulation and the capacity of forests to rebound. I haven't been back recently enough to know what's happened in those plots now. Maybe eventually they overtake the capacity for browse, and it's a temporal delay. But I could imagine having certainly carbon effects, but also biodiversity influences, because it's going to shift the species composition of the regeneration environment. I don't have more specifics to share, but I know it can be important.
No, that's a great anecdote. Thanks for sharing that. Anyone else have anything to contribute to this question?
I just have a story that, I don't know why it always makes me laugh, but I think I've said this to Mark before, but really early on, when climate change was kind of just becoming something conservationists were really paying attention to, there was it was like a 230-page report from Massachusetts, which is always at the forefront of kind of advancing climate. And they had done a report on habitat adaptation and vulnerabilities. And, this long report. And my takeaway, I was really curious, okay, what do we do about climate change? Deer browse was the biggest takeaway from that entire report. And I'm like, well, that, we have to do a lot of work, but it's the same stressors, to our system, as always. And so I just always think it's funny that we can jump through a lot of hoops and get to the same place, but.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, another way of looking at it, right, is we're talking about forests and trees and wood and lignin and roots, and rapidly converting that to what makes a deer, sugar and animal tissues. So we're taking something that takes centuries to decompose to something that takes months to decompose. So could be a significant shift in the biomass in that ecosystem. Different way of looking at that. And then while we're talking about animals, I have to ask one other question related to animals before we start to try to bring this full circle here. Kudos to this person for asking a question about pollinators. We've been talking a lot about carbon and forests, but let's not forget about pollinators and the role that they play. And so this question specifically about bees, but I'm going to make it broader than bees. And it asks, how important of a role do healthy pollinators, such as bees, play in carbon sequestration with respect to climate change? So interesting question there, and thank you for asking it. A lot of thinking, uncertainty. I'll start and say, I know, it's a challenging question, because in the way I'm trying to answer it is I'm thinking, okay, what's wind pollinated and what's insect pollinated in these forests, and that as the first part of my approach. And I know certain dominant species in Central Appalachian forests are most certainly wind pollinated, but I also know that the plant material those species produce, is such as oak leaves and cherry leaves and things like that, support huge numbers of pollinators, as caterpillars and things like that. So I'm saying that just to try to see if that that serves as some starter fluid for anybody else's thoughts on this issue. But yeah, I'll stop there and reiterate that it's an interesting but difficult question.
I mean, it's hard to tie like a direct line for me from pollinator to carbon, but the decline in butterflies and the decline in other pollinators, the 40% abundance drops, those, to me, this is very scary ecological news. And all of our flowering trees are adapted to insect pollination, and it behooves us to keep the pollinators. And I think we should be very worried if we're losing pollinators, in our natural systems. There are wind pollinated trees, sure, but I don't know the direct impact that it will have on carbon. So,
well, the asker of that question gets the award for best stumped question.
Well, one thing that comes to mind, it may be a little far-fetched, but as you reduce density of forests through prescribed burning, thinning, other operations to try to restore more of a natural structure, you're going to get more flowering plants, forbs in the ground layer. And so those are going to attract pollinators. In general, a very dense small stem stand is going to have the fewest wildflowers and the fewest pollinators. Whether that's directly relevant to the question or not, I'm not sure.
No, thanks for that, Reed. Okay, looking at the time, I think we have time for one last question before we close our panel and give the symposium back to Lisa. And so this basically is a question for discussion is, how do you, members of the panel, think we should consider balancing human values of carbon sequestration and carbon sinks with wood demand? So looking at these forests, and we're asking them, we being our society, is asking them to do two jobs. It's asking them to pull mineral carbon out of the atmosphere and lock it away, and it's asking them to produce our houses and paper and other wood products. So what would your closing thoughts be on trying to reconcile those two challenging goals? I almost said diametric, but I don't think they are.
Well, ultimately, I mean, stabilizing and then reducing the human population is going to reduce those demands and help meet both of those goals. But managers don't have a lot of control about that. Policymakers might, however.
well, I'll say, I'm really excited about the 30 by 30 movement in the beautiful movement in the US. But 30% in my mind, that really has to be focused on biodiversity, and it can encompass a whole lot of carbon. But for us to solve our human created climate problem, we need like 70% for carbon. We need 30% for biodiversity, and then another 30 or 40 or 50% for carbon, or we're not really going to solve it. And you can't cram, in my mind, you can't cram all that into that 30% for biodiversity. We really have to get real with ourselves about what we have done to our atmosphere and what it's going to take to reverse that. That said, the green energy trends recently have started to look really great. They're really changing things. So
Thanks, Mark. And before I hand it back to Lisa, any other thoughts? Anybody else? Chris?
I mean, not all harvesting is the same. And I think it's really important to think about that as well. There are some products that are sequester carbon. It can be large engineered wood in building structures, and that has a totally different life cycle analysis result than wood pellets. I think we shouldn't be looking to our forests in general for biofuels as an expanded way to get to find our way out of the climate change problem. And some of this this question to me poses, I mean, it does tilt us in the direction of almost looking elsewhere. Maybe appreciating the value of forest carbon, but really managing forests, not just for carbon, but for all these other components that we've been talking about, biodiversity also for harvesting and timber needs, but then looking to zero our emissions with deep decarbonization of society. I mean, for me, it really comes back to, I think that needs to be front and center in all of these conversations, that's what needs to be done. We need to zero the emissions and then soak up the rest. And the land base can participate a little bit in the soaking up and mitigating historic emissions, but I'm not sure we should really be turning to it with a lot of focus for thinking about how to get to zero in our emissions portfolio today and in the future.
I think that's a fair observation and a good spot to close. I'll just close before one last comment I'd like to make for all of the land managers and stewards who've tuned in today. I would just encourage you to take what we've learned today and, as best you can, apply it to applying the smartest, best stewardship we can to the natural areas we have. We're individually, none of us is going to get close to an order of magnitude of solving these sorts of challenges, but we can make a difference, and in aggregate, it will make a meaningful difference, I think, for these challenges. And then the last thing I'd like to say to everyone, the five of you, is thank you all for your time. This has been great. I've learned a lot. I've really appreciated our time together, and hope to follow up with you all on some questions that have occurred to me today. And thanks for our audience for sticking around. And with that, Lisa, would you like to conclude today?
You bet, Ryan. I think you've helped to do this. We want to thank each and every one of you, Reed, Mark, Chris, Abby, Charles, and of course you, Ryan, our wonderful facilitator today. This was a tremendously rich and inspiring symposium. I only wish we had so many more people participating in it, and we're going to work hard to make sure that this does get shared more broadly. But on behalf of everyone at NAA, participate and anybody participating today, thanks for taking the time to share all that you're learning about the vital role that natural areas play in climate resilience. The audience was excellent. You offered really important information. You asked the right questions. And, while this program was generally focused on Appalachian forests, the concepts discussed are broadly applicable, and we want to carry this conversation to other ecosystems. It's absolutely important. And I just want to thank Mark and Ryan and others for putting the plug in for Dr. Suzanne Simard. Didn't expect so much conversation around her and her work, but please join us on December 1st to continue a lot of this conversation. And I'm hoping that all of our panelists will be able to join us for that as well. I'd like to thank Ephraim Zimmerman and Charles Beer again for helping NAA to make this program a reality. And last but not least, thank you to the Colcom Foundation for supporting this symposium. Your investment definitely is making a difference in the work that our practitioners do. So thanks to everybody for joining us. Enjoy your weekend, and we look forward to seeing you again at a future Natural Areas Association program where we can continue these rich and informative conversations.